slipped the surly bonds of earth and danced the skies on laughter's silvered wings. Sunward I've climbed and joined the tumbling mirth of sun-split clouds, and done 100 things you have not dreamed of. Wheeled and soared and swung high in the sunlit silence. Hovering there, I've chased the shouting wind along and flung my eager craft through footless halls of air. Up the long, delirious, burning blue, I've topped the windswept heights with easy grace, where never lark nor even eagle flew. And while with silent, lifting mind, I've trod the high, untrespassed sanctity of space, put out my hand and touched the face of God.
Hello and welcome to Examining Evolution. I'm here with Sal Cordova. He's a molecular biophysics researcher, and he's recently has some published work in Springer Nature. And he's going to be talking about the difficulties with the evolution of the nervous system and nerves. So welcome, Sal.
Thank you. Thank you. We're going to try to make this short. This is actually another attempt at trying to record this because the last round was so technical, and Rebecca's always been able to give me good feedback on how to improve the presentation. So the nervous system, sometimes we don't realize how privileged it is to be a human being. We can experience things like music and sound. We can have conversations. We can smell the aroma of a rose, and we can touch and feel things. We can see things and hear things. This is all made possible by the nervous system. And sadly, we see what happens when the nervous system is not functioning in paraplegics and quadriplegics, where somehow the nervous system is severed. But this gives us an insight into how delicate and how well crafted and how essential so many of the parts of the nervous system are. How this relates to the problem of evolution, I'm going to walk through just a few pieces of it, because if we were to examine all the evolutionary novelties and things that have to emerge to make this feasible, it would probably take a lifetime. The nervous system is so complex, and we're only beginning to understand it. Starting with, the most complex, and some people have referred to the most complex system in the entire universe is the human brain. The human brain has, by some estimates, not me, has more connections in it than all the routers and switches on the World Wide Web. It is just a phenomenal machine. A machine that almost denigrates what it is. It is just a wonder. And it could process all of these sensory inputs. So we're only going to cover just a little bit because there's no way we're going to be able to account. But my goal here is to show that it's very difficult to evolve a working nervous system. Now, one way, what evolutionists do, and it's understandable that they'll do this, they'll say, some of the parts of the nervous system existed in the bacteria. But I liken this to be, it's like saying, well, we have all the ingredients, let's say in a kitchen, like when we see some of these cooking shows like Beat Bobby Flay, where two chefs battle it out. They begin with the same set of ingredients on the kitchen shelf, but they have to decide how to put it together. Like now, for someone like me, I would totally lose a battle like that because I really don't know how to cook, except maybe I can sometimes boil water. But I actually messed that up one time, burned the pot because I left it on the stove. Okay, so that's my cooking adventure. But the point is, just because you have the ingredients, like say some of the ingredients, and I'll emphasize some, and sometimes it's a very small subset, in a primitive cell, like say a prokaryote, a bacteria, or an archaea cell, that means because you find the same ingredients in, like say, a human, or what we would call the homologs of them, that it's easy to evolve all the rest. But this is like saying, okay, just because you have two chefs in a kitchen, that they'll easily be able to take the ingredients and make something new and novel. And it really does take a lot of skill. If we humans were trying to build a human from scratch, which we absolutely cannot do, it would take a lot of skill to take even if we gave you all the parts. And James Tour famously said, when he was talking about the origin of life, but this is extensible to building an entire human being, he said, I'll give you all the parts. Now you try to build it from scratch. Just think about how difficult that would be. So to assume that just because some of the parts exist in primitive cells doesn't mean that it's going to evolve. Now, evolutionists have often said, oh, co-option is how all of this evolved. And it's like, it's more complicated than that, because you might be able to reuse some parts from a primitive ancestor, but then you have to add new parts, which is another problem in and of itself. And then you have to get them to connect together.
And you have to do that all by natural processes with no intelligence involved,
exactly.
Right? Because when you're saying, the human body, if you gave people all the parts of the human body, we couldn't put the human body together just from the parts, even with all of our intelligence working together. But with evolution, you've got to get it to happen by purely natural processes, with no one with any, no person or no entity with the, awareness of or foresight of what needs to happen.
Exactly. And so we have some of these artificial, like knees or whatever, and artificial parts of the body, and it's not easy to engineer. Yet the body is able to stitch itself together from the point of, the zygote and embryo, and then the developmental process. So all that quote unquote information, and I don't like using the information argument, but for lack of a better term, it needs to somehow have that blueprint of how to construct, and all the recipe. So rather than information, how about, let's say, the recipe and assembly instructions? You think about how difficult it's going to be to build all these parts and to do it very effectively and in a coordinated fashion. Now, the nerve cell is a very special cell, and you can, I don't know, for some reason I stumbled on it because of my background. Just for some of the viewers here who are not familiar with who I am, I was actually in the aerospace and defense industry for 20 years. I have 5 degrees in science, and my 3 undergrads were engineer related, one in electrical engineering. And I went on to get a master's in applied physics at Johns Hopkins, and then I got a degree in biology, an unaccredited degree in biology at the FAS graduate school at the NIH, because I was working for a world-class geneticist, and he sent me off to school to study biology. And as I studied the nerve cell, I was just like, this is so cool, because it integrates my electrical engineering background, it integrates the biology and a little bit of the physics. And I said, this is just so cool. And not to mention, nerve cells, every cell in the human body is just amazing. But I think the nerve cell, especially since it's essential to making the most complex organ in the universe, the brain, I think they're very, very special. And I'm going to walk through the evolution of how difficult it is to build a functioning nervous system. Again, this is only going to be a cursory examination of this topic because it's so deep, but we'll just start with the cells. So if you could show, Rebecca, the first the first diagram here, the first major step in building a nervous system is building a eukaryotic cell. How the eukaryotic cell, and that's pictured on the right there, how it evolved, there are various scenarios that the evolutionists have put forward. We could say that one scenario, the typical scenario is that the eukaryotic cell evolved from a prokaryotic cell. Now, some people might reject that, but however, they might say, well, there is a common ancestor, the prokaryote and eukaryote. However you frame it, there are going to be difficulties in the transition from prokaryote to eukaryote, primarily because of the membrane-bound organelles. And I'll just highlight here, particularly the nucleus here that has the membrane. And we can do another show on this. That's a whole nother one. But I just, in brief, say that a professor of molecular biology who teaches the differences between these cells, as she studied them, she began to question evolutionary theories seriously. And she is the author of the book Stairway to Life. Her name is Professor Change Laura Tan. So we save that for another one, that without the eukaryotic cell, there is not going to be a nerve cell. And so I would say in examining evolution, this step is, pretty much settled that evolution cannot solve this. And I'll challenge anyone to try to contest me on that claim. But we'll move on since we're specifically focusing on nerve cells. So I just grabbed this diagram from the internet, and there are various ways, there are various classifications of cells, cell types. So in the human body, excluding the cancer cell, which is on the lower right here, because that's not really, that's a deviant cell type. But look at all the typical cell types. We have the stem cell types from which other cells can come from. So that's why it's put at the upper left corner, because all the other cells come from stem cells. It's somewhere along the line. And the ultimate one being what we call totipotent stem cells that have all the information to make all the other classes of cells. So we have bone cells, blood cells, muscle cells, fat cells, skin cells, nerve cells, which is the subject of today. We have endothelial cells, sex cells, and pancreatic cells. But there are even more than this. We have like hepatocytes, which are liver cells. We have myocytes, which are heart cells. And depending on how we classify all of them, we could come up with numbers of like 200 to 300 cell types. Other classification schemes will put them in the numbers of thousands, but they're, it doesn't do justice to show them as spherical, really, because the muscle cells and the nerve cells could be shaped differently. And we were talking about reusing ingredients of how a chef does this. Just think about this: is that each of these cells have a very similar architectures, but they're shutting the way they're able to make these different recipes of cells is actually shutting off or adding different mixes of ingredients. So they all have, almost all of them, not quite, have the same set of genes. And yet they could use, and those genes will create proteins that end up being the raw ingredients. But if, depending on how you, how the cell decides to make the proportion of ingredients and where it locates it in the cell, you can make a very different cell. And this is really amazing. So there are actually multiple recipes in that stem cell that it can pass on and make all these other cells, the process of differentiation. So evolution has to solve those problems. And one could see that a change to a single gene could affect a whole bunch of different cells. And this is the problem in what we call engineering, and in a term my boss coined was polyconstraint. It's very difficult to construct something like this, because if you try to build, optimize for one cell, you might be damaging something else. But we'll move on. So focus on this nerve cell. And I want to point out, this is a good approximation that the eukaryotic cell is this sphere. But the nerve cell is a eukaryotic cell, but it's shaped different. And you could see it here. It's very different. You can kind of there are parts of this, that you would see in that spherical approximation, like the nucleus here. But then it has the cell membrane. Okay, so let me see here. We have this like the cell coat or the cell membrane out here. It's called the plasma membrane, right, around the sphere. Yep. In the nerve cell, it's just imagine that now it has to be contorted to look like that. So the plasma membrane is surrounding it. So how does it know to shape itself that way is the first thing. It has to evolve that. So there are variety. And I said there, depending on how we want to classify cell types, we could get that into thousands. So even though, and there's not just one type, even though I mentioned nerve cell, which you also call a neuron, there are actually several different classes of nerve cells or neurons. And I'll show them here. Here's one classification scheme. They have these motor neurons, these pyramidal neurons, Purkinje cells, retinal neuron. We'll cover today the olfactory neuron. And the retinal neuron helps you see. The olfactory neuron helps you smell. There's this unipolar neuron that helps you sense pain and touch. And there are other kinds of neurons here. And I took a class in cellular neuroscience that was run by an electrical engineer and also a bioengineer. It was marvelous. When I took an exam, I had to identify the particular neuron cell type, just kind of based on the shape. And that was kind of an interesting exercise. But here's my favorite, the chandelier cells. So you have some neurons that can help you smell and see. This one helps you think. This is recently discovered. Wow. This would be where it's hanging from the ceiling, and then here are all the candles. It's beautiful. And here's another picture of the chandelier cell. And so those are neurons. So the first thing, obviously, that has to evolve is we're going to go from this globular shape to a neuron shape. And this is rather important. And let me see if I could throw this up. There is a nice website called Neuroscience for Kids. Look it up and you could see it goes into this. And I like this because you can reach the most general audience just going through this. I found out, and there's a section here, it says, how long is the longest neuron? It's about 1 meter long. So we normally think of cells being really teeny tiny, like the end of a pin. And this may be very teeny tiny too, but it's very long. There's one nerve cell that is 1 meter long, which is just incredible. So just think of that globular cell now having to be long. That motor cell that's 1 meter long. And that'll, I would presume that connects to that's on the spine. And so it helps you operate like when you want to play piano or write or type on the keyboard. It's going through that long axon. Now, there's something else I need to point out. We have, and you'll see in this diagram, it says synaptic terminals. Synaptic terminals. So what happens is you have, when a signal is being transmitted, many times it connects to another nerve cell, much like when you're taking a plug and connecting it to an extension cord. Just think of the synapse as being able to connect one nerve cell to another. And that's what we call, where it connects is the synapse. And that's another problem of evolving. Okay, so go back to that diagram of the circular cell here. It's going to evolve, and it's going to have a little region here that's going to grow real long, and it's going to eventually have a whole bunch of specialized machinery in it that creates this synapse. So it can transmit a signal. So let's go back here. So let's say you have a signal here, and it's traveling down the axon. It's going to go to the axon terminal. And here's the picture of the axon terminal here. and then you have the dendrite of another nerve. And so the axon there is going to fire off all these chemicals that the dendrite is going to receive. Now you could see that this is going to be problematic because for this to work, that cell has to evolve the dendrites and the axons to connect to each other. Not to mention they have to be located together. Okay.
Well, but some people will respond to that by just saying, well, you've got millions of years, and they can imagine that, this thing slowly developing over time and maybe having some other use in the body until it becomes useful for being a nerve cell. So how do you respond to that?
I'd respond to it the way we ended the last video we did on ion channels. I'd say, prove it. Prove it.
Well, why would you think it would be unlikely?
Well, we'll cover part of that right now.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is a nice segue to the next part. Consider what would happen, for example, if you just had just an isolated nerve cell in an organism and it's not integrated. It's just going to be sending signals and it's kind of going to a dead end. Doesn't connect to anything, doesn't do anything for the cell. Why would natural selection select for that? One thing I keep telling evolutionists, you can't, it's not reasonable to think that natural selection will select for something that doesn't exist. If it's not favorable to the organism, then it's extra baggage. And we know from experimental observation, like say in looking at what we call the pangenomes of bacteria, extra baggage is usually disposed with.
Could it have had another purpose during?
Yes, it can, and it does reuse parts.
Okay.
And so when I think we opened the show and I was talking about, you could have two chefs that use the same ingredients, and yes, it could be repurposed. So I'm not even disputing that the parts could be reused, but it's how you assemble it. So the issue is, let's just say hypothetically we've reused some of the parts, but there is no benefit to having a partially formed nervous system. We sadly know that when we've had these victims of spinal injuries where you have all the nerves are in place, but then they can't walk, or they can't, sadly sometimes even use their arms. So the point I was going to go to was that if you have an axon that's not long enough to connect to the next nerve, the nervous system, as far as that connection it's gone. So if you have an organism that doesn't develop axons and when it needs it, or dendrites, it's just not going to work. And why would selection keep this around? The thing I see with evolutionary biologists, they said, well, it's useful now, therefore selection selected for it before it existed. I'm like, no, sir, that's not going to work. This is like when you're trying to log in and you've forgotten your password and you know that it was something you can't type off the top of your head. Just hypothetically, let's say you're in that situation. The computer's not going to say, oh, you're getting warmer, it'll let you log halfway in, and then at least you're a little bit closer, and then you modify it and you can tell, okay, you modify your password, and then the computer says, okay, you're 3/4 of the way in. That way you kind of know that you're getting closer to the goal. But evolutionary theory, orthodox theory anyway, says that it has no goal. And I often say, if you have no goal, you're not gonna. If you have no direction, you'll end up nowhere. You'll be kind of aimless. So they'll say, you have millions of years, but there's no direction.
And it seems to me, correct me if I'm wrong, but like the types of organisms that use nerve cells really can't function without nerve cells, right? So it's hard to imagine that an organism that doesn't use nerve cells would be able to develop the nerve cells.
Right.
And then an organism that, is in the process of developing nerve cells, well, how is that organism going to live without the nerve cells?
Yeah, exactly. So me having been a scientist and engineer in the aerospace industry for 20 years, I'd say, okay, why don't we settle this experimentally, this scientific method? Why don't you try and make an organism like that and see if it starts to evolve a nervous system? Of course, I'd start them off, and I know they'll resent me for this, but I'll say, okay, why don't you just start first with a prokaryotic cell? Tell me why you would expect it to evolve into anything as complex as a eukaryotic cell. Of course, they're going to give up at that point, and they say, well, just millions of years. At that point, I'll say, you have no proof of that, for one, and you're just assuming it. There's nothing in terms of cellular theory that would say that this is a natural transition, and we'll cover that in another show. So all you have is faith. You're making a faith claim, and what they'll appeal to is like the fossil record of dinosaurs and the transition to birds. They'll talk about the similarity of chimps and apes, and humans. And I'll say, I'll grant you all that. You can't take that though and say, therefore this evolves naturally like a nerve cell. That's what we call in logic a non sequitur. So that's the first thing. And then the next thing I'll say is like, okay, so now you have to deal with the evolution of the cell types. Which cell type are you'll say, okay, well, the nerve cell's similar to some other cell type. I'll even grant you that. But you still have, as you said, let's experimentally take an organism that needed a nervous system and knock it out. And well, if it dies, that sort of says that's kind of problematic. How's natural selection going to work on something dead? And they'll say, well, it probably evolved from a creature that didn't need the nerve cell. And just like, okay, how do you prove that? Because one thing I'll point out is selection is very strong for something that's essential, right? Like you need a heart to live. If you're missing a heart, you're not going to be alive. So what an evolutionary biologist said, well, clearly selection created that because it's so essential. And I'm like, no, it doesn't work that way, because if it's essential and it's not there, it's dead. Therefore, selection won't work. I don't know if that made sense.
Yeah, and I mean, the type of organisms that use all of these types of cells, or most of them, which type would they be able to live without while it was busy evolving? Like,
well, let's say you didn't have sex cells, you'd still be able to be alive, but you won't be able to reproduce.
Right. So you've got to have that. Absolutely.
Without bone cells, you're dead, because you'll just be like a jellyfish. Without blood cells, you won't have blood.
Well, maybe the organism was maybe it was a jellyfish. I mean, so could we? I guess we could live with it.
Okay, no, this is a good point. So let's say we're like a jellyfish.
Okay.
Let me point out some evolutionary logic here. If it's essential now that you have bones in our architecture, and it's not essential for a jellyfish, how can you say then that there's selection pressure on a jellyfish to evolve bones? You can't use the fact that it's essential for a human to have bones in the present architecture of a human architecture as proof that selection pressure existed in the past. That's something they don't seem to get. Okay, so it's essential now for a human to have bone cells. He'd be pretty much effectively dead without them, okay? So you could say, well, selection pressure clearly exists now, but that's no proof that it existed in the past. And the jellyfish is one example. It doesn't look like there's a lot of selection pressure for it to start to develop bone cells. What's it going to do with the bone cell if it didn't have an architecture in mind to actually use bones? And so that's the thing that keeps coming up. And there's a great book by a world famous chemist, another great chemist by the name of Marcus Eberlin. He taught 200 PhD chemists. He's friends with many Nobel Prize winners, and he wrote the book Foresight. You could see that the architecture of biology has lots of foresight. So the word selection really is a misnomer in evolutionary biology, because selection means when you select something, you have a goal in mind. That's why you're choosing for something. They have tried to say nature kind of mimics that by choosing for things too, but at best, it will just look for reproductive success. It doesn't have a goal in mind. And it's becoming very evident that most, well, evolutionary biologists will call beneficial mutations or improvements are not really functional improvements. They're increases in reproductive success or capacity. What we call differential reproductive success. So my favorite example is the fact, and you'll see many of these, many papers on this. Just Google, we're getting dumber. Just Google, human race is getting dumber, or you'll see this. And there have been papers that said natural selection is selecting for dumber kids. And why would that be? One basic reason is very intelligent people, especially women, have fewer kids. Many of them are childless. But we, that's just an example, but we see this like uniformly across biology. There's a paper, the dominant mode of evolution is reductive, meaning it's losing capability. We see this in the lab, we see it in field observations, and sadly, the ultimate is extinction. So we have a lot of complex organisms in the biosphere that are dying out, especially birds. So when they said you have millions of years, and just like, okay, that's more millions of years for natural selection to destroy. So Darwin put forward the idea that natural selection constructs. We're finding out that it doesn't. The net result, the only place where natural selection, the net result is construction. I say net result because you'll have a few exceptions here and there where natural selection does lead to some functional improvement, but the net direction is destruction. So the only place that it's constructive net is in the imagination of evolutionary biologists. And I'm happy to defend that claim. And usually what they'll say is, Sal, you don't understand evolution. I was like, okay. Yeah. And the first thing I'll confront them with is, I said, how much population genetics have you studied? How much have you published on this?
Well, Sal, with regard to the nerve cell, can you talk about what is actually happening in that nerve cell that is so amazing? I mean, in a way, it just, we're just seeing a picture of it, but right. What's actually going on inside that makes it so difficult for it to evolve?
Okay, the first part is just being able to make that lengthy wire, because you could see, and this has perplexed me. I said, the tendency of the cell is really to be that globular sphere. It's just kind of a natural architecture for something. How does it start to make something like that's a meter long? Mm-hmm. And they'll say, well, it didn't start out that way. And they'll say, okay, I'll grant you that. Okay, so now it starts to develop an axon. And in that axon, the way it transmits the electrical signal, and I'm going to have to simplify this because when we tried to do this with ion channels and action potentials, it got to be a little bit too deep in the weeds. But think about dominoes. If you've seen how people can arrange dominoes in a row or whatever, and you trip one domino at the start, and it's just going to have that, what they call the domino effect, and it basically will transmit that following domino. It's like a signal. You can actually build a primitive signaling system that way. If you build a Rube Goldberg machine, I've seen Rube Goldberg machines that use the dominoes as a method of transmission. So again, this is a gross simplification, so we don't get down into the weeds. But in the axon, if we could show that the slide again. So what ends up happening is that the nerve signal will come along this axon, and that's like the dominoes falling. That action potential is going to go through here.
But what is it? What is it that's going through there? Like, where is this signal coming from?
It is the changes in concentration of the potassium and sodium ions relative to the inside and outside of the cell. And that's why it was a 13-minute video that bored everyone to tears except electrical engineers. So what's happening is in that other video where we talked about the ion channel, the potassium channel. Okay, so the potassium channel appears in bacteria, but it has a different purpose. So again, this theme of co-opting ingredients that are used for other purposes, I'll grant you that. And then there's the sodium channel. So what ends up happening is there'll be lots of, I could get this backward. There's lots of sodium inside the axon. And then when the action potential goes through, a lot of these sodium ions go outside. And you could start to see this, and it just ends up cascading. That's like the domino. And we'll need, there are some videos that are, unfortunately, you need licensing to actually show how it can give you that domino effect. But the incredible thing about the way the nerve does this is that when those dominoes fall, so to speak, and as that action potential just propagates down this axon, or it's analogous to a wire. As it's propagating down here, after a little while, the dominoes kind of get reset and stood up again so that it's capable of sending another signal. So briefly, when a signal comes through here, there's a brief moment, it's not able to resend another signal until it resets.
Right. So like it's somehow there's a chemical process that is providing information that's going to be passed to your brain. And but what initiates this chemical process? Because I mean,
okay,
in each one of these different nerve cells, you said you have the olfactory one, you've got the one that allows you to see, you've got, so like, what is it in these cells that allows these chemicals to pass that information?
So in the case of, let's say the olfactory, the ability to smell, so a molecule, and it's really amazing, we can actually, many creatures can sense a single molecule out of the sea. So like the dogs have really good sense of smell. They can sense like cadavers, and there are 2 amino acids I think they can smell, the cadaverine and putrescine. And I'm just guessing here because there are, even a fly can smell like a cadaver from a mile away. That means it's able to sense one single molecule, which is amazing. And so that molecule park, you have these, you could see the olfactory nerve cells here, and just kind of imagine then we have that this is an olfactory nerve cell. The molecule will park here, and there are chemical processes that will react to the presence of that molecule. And it'll start to generate a signal. And I think actually we're still figuring out how it does this, because you asked the specific chemical process. One Nobel Prize was awarded to someone who figured out a lot about the olfactory system. That's how big a deal it is to understand how this works. If I asked the chemist to build an artificial nose that can smell all these things, he'd probably go crazy. Because
yeah, that's what I was going to say. You can imagine a process by which you could have like, okay, the presence of a chemical versus not presence of a chemical. But we can interpret so many different chemicals. Like there's, it's not just a one thing. It's, there's so much different interpretation that goes on.
Exactly. And not only that, as I said, we can detect some noses of, some smelling systems of creatures, like even the fly that's looking for a cadaver to put its eggs that become maggots and then other flies. It can smell a single molecule. And then the butterflies that mate, there's also kind of I believe, one sort of exchange of being able to smell each other. It's just remarkable, these single molecule systems. And the physicist Bialik, he said, there's lots of optimization in biology where you're at the extreme limit of physics. You cannot detect anything smaller than a molecule. So these olfactory systems, you asked how it does this, and I gave a roundabout answer in saying, I don't know, and I'm not sure anyone absolutely knows. We're still figuring out the process of how it can amplify. So think about what has to happen. As to sense that one molecule is going to amplify that it detected it. And then what ends up happening is it starts to generate, it starts to, what they call, for you math and engineering geeks, it starts to integrate the signal here. And when it collects enough, when the integral is big enough, it's going to say, hey, time to fire a signal off. And it's going to send that action potential down here. It's basically like saying, okay, now trigger the dominoes, trigger the domino effect. And it's going to travel down that axon. And in the case of the olfactory system, it connects to things I think are called the mitral cells, which are other neurons. And this whole network of neurons, it helps to filter out and amplify and do all sorts of things that electrical engineers are familiar with, knowing how to process signals. So this is why, so it's doing initial sensing, it's amplifying it through the process that we call integration. After it integrates, it's going to send that signal. So now it's a nice amplified signal. And then in here, so you could see the diagram of the olfactory cells here, and then it starts to connect to these mitral neurons that then connect to the brain. And who knows where it goes from that point. But just think again, going back to the diagram of the basic eukaryotic cell, you have to evolve that shape to evolve to that. And not only that, at the very ends of the membrane here, it has to create that synapse so it can connect. Now, the tricky thing is, for an olfactory cell, this is out at the nose here, for lack of a better word. It's not exactly in the nose, but you get my drift. It's close enough. It has to know, this part is going to start to smell these molecules. And in the case of flies, it'll sense one molecule wherever its quote unquote nose is. But in the other case, like say a retinal cell, it has to sense a photon. So how does it construct? It's like, okay, it's going to build a molecule sensing thing, and that's the olfactory. In another case, it's going to sense individual photons, because the eye can sense individual photons, another optimization at the limits of physics. And then for the ear, it's going to sense vibrations, and that's also optimal with the Corti organs, etc. In the case of touch, it senses pressure. In the case of temperature, it senses temperature. So
the issues with the evolutionary model is, how did a nerve cell ever develop? How, if it did, then we've still got to get the development of all these different types of nerve cells. They have to be able to work together in unison and get the information to the brain, and the brain has to be able to interpret. And then, I'm kind of wondering, is there, in the evolution model, is there a common ancestor of the nerve cell? And is there a common ancestor for all olfactory nerve cells? Is there a common ancestor for all retinal nerve cells? Like, for each of these different type of cells that you mentioned that have to do completely different functions, according to the evolutionary model, is there a common ancestor for that? Or did it develop in separate lineages?
Yes and no. what I mean by yes is you can get pieces. Some pieces of it do exist even in the bacterial cell. So like for example, I mean, there are parts of this cell, like there's so many pumps and channels, and you could find pieces of those channels even in the bacterial cell. But then there are parts that are just outrightly novel that don't have any ancestors. And the easiest tally of that is what's in the eukaryotic cell that's not in the bacterial cell. So I'm just going to say, okay, let's just go to the very beginning, because that's where the accounting is the most clear at this stage of our knowledge. It's very clear. You don't have a eukaryotic cell, you don't have a nerve cell. So then they'll say, okay, let's grant the eukaryotic cell. I'm like, that's pretty generous there, but okay, let's grant that. Are there other parts? And it's like, well, it's just, again, like the two chefs battling it out on Beat Bobby Flay. You might have some of the raw ingredients there, because after all, this is just changing the sequences of amino acids as far as the proteins go. So, I mean, it's amazing that the protein is built of 20 canonical amino acids. There can be a couple others that are added, but that's kind of obscure. But you can build all these things with those basic, it's just like the alphabet. You can write these beautiful novels, and you only have an alphabet of 26 letters. So at the fundamental, you could say, well, yeah, you know, it's all kind of the same stuff. The issue is, even if you could reuse the parts, just because you use the same alphabetic letters to type your password doesn't mean someone else is going to figure it out. And there are problems with evolution that are just like that. You may have the same starting set of ingredients. Does it mean you can build? You know, does that mean like a first grader can write a classic novel just because he understands the alphabet, like, you know, a novelist? And so they will kind of primitively say, oh yeah, we have a little sequence here in one gene that's kind of like what you need in another. And this is a whole nother topic when we talk about promiscuous domains and proteins. We don't need to go there. But yeah, basically what they're saying, you get little pieces of this here, little pieces of this gene, and you stitch the genes together, and you'll be able to build a new gene that you kind of need to be able to implement a nerve cell. And I'm just like, this is absolutely ridiculous. I mean, for me personally, because, you know, you need the right recipe. You can't just take random pieces of this and that and expect it to be coherent. So maybe in the extreme, why don't you put a nerve cell in a blender and see if it comes out, because you'll have all the evolutionary pieces there, and see if you get anything. Trying to say that this evolves just because you have pieces from before, I just like, no, sir, that's just not going to work.
Well, Sal, if it's not going to work, and if it's so clear to you, then why is it that most biologists believe in evolution?
Well, we're going to do a show on the reasons evolution's believed, but I think fundamentally there are like philosophical reasons that I think are legitimate. Darwin's daughter died, and the problem of evil is a big philosophical thing. And I don't want to minimize human pain, because that's a big deal, because we'll say, how can it,
but Sal, getting away from metaphysical and philosophical. I mean, if
scientifically,
I mean, surely they don't have a basis. So,
well, I'll give you the one scientific thing, and me who rejects evolutionary theory at this point, is the similarity of forms. So when we had the Maury show, and I quote this a lot because it's the best example, where they're trying to figure out the paternity. They have a couple there, and they're disputing whether the guy's the father or not. At the end of the show, he says, "You are the father, you're not the father." The way they're able to detect that is similarity, particularly shared errors. So that does, we have shared errors with other creatures like chimpanzees. I see it in my gene browsing. That would lend credence to the idea of universal common ancestry. But strictly speaking, that's a different question than the evolution of complexity. And so people like Michael Behe and Michael Denton accept universal common ancestry, but say What is not explained is how the complexity could evolve, because it would suggest we need a mechanism that has foresight.
Well, do you think it's fair to just say, well, if we have that evidence for common ancestry, which I don't accept anyway as proof of common ancestry, but if we, and I know you don't either, but if you can show common ancestry, then it doesn't matter how outlandish the stories are. We know it happened, and that's why we believe it.
That's generally how we go. But I have to emphasize the metaphysical component. This is, when I looked at this, I said, this is all accepted because of a lot of it's accepted because of metaphysics. And I don't want to minimize, it's very, very, very powerful. And there are many levels of the metaphysical reasons, but the scientific reasons, we conflate universal common ancestry and similarity with the evolution of complexity. They're two separate things. And people like Michael Behe and Michael Denton have noted, we're making that very good distinction. I'm like, bravo for you, because you can establish common ancestry, so to speak, or at least provisionally, or for the sake of argument, just like that, the Maury show, and saying, yeah, you are the father, or you have an ancestor here. Let's just grant that. It's still a separate question how an eye can evolve from a bacteria, or all these different classes of nerve cells. It's just amazing that, you need a specialized nerve cell to smell, another kind to help you hear, another kind to help you see. Oh, I forgot taste. Taste is another one. And then, touch, but you can also sense temperature. You need different mechanical processes to do this. And half-formed systems just are not going to be selected for, because you can't select for what doesn't exist. You can select for the parts, and I granted you, I'll grant that. We call it co-option. But just starting out with the same ingredients doesn't mean you're going to be able to make the right recipe. The problem is the recipe, not the ingredients at this point. But even beyond that, we're finding out there are some specialized ingredients that exist in us that don't exist, like, say, in bacteria. And we call those, for lack of a better term, I'll call them orphan gene families. Orphan genes are taxonomically restricted. And that's a whole nother topic. But I can say, just because you can co-opt some parts doesn't mean you can automatically evolve the other parts you absolutely need that don't exist. And I'll just throw this out there for the aficionados. Look at the spliceosomal intron, the spliceosome that processes the spliceosomal intron in eukaryotes. They took one gene out of the bacteria and said that's similar to one of the 200 genes in the spliceosome, and said that's evidence the prokaryote evolved into a eukaryote. Because of one gene, you had 199 new parts that weren't in the prokaryote, but that's their evidence. That's an example of really stretching common ancestry to prove you can evolve new things. And I just protested. I said that's ridiculous. And if you look at that system, you're just like, you have that problem of complexity. So you can co-opt some parts, but then you have to evolve lots of new ones, as in the case of the spliceosome. And so this is not taught in textbooks. My biochemistry textbook used that. They said, well, this looks like it evolved, because they were very pro-evolution. And I'm just like, you got to be kidding. That's just because you can find one gene in the spliceosome that exists in a prokaryote, you're going to say the other 199 evolved naturally. I'm just like, that's a non sequitur. So there's my tirade there.
Right. I mean, and I'm thinking about, even if you have all of these different types of nerve cells that happened to get the way they are, you've still got to get a system to nourish all of these types of cells. And you've got to get all of this to work together in harmony.
Well, you got to get it positioned in the right place. What if you had your olfactory nerves in your eye and then your retinal nerves in your nose? You're not going to be able to see or smell. So you need The system needs to know where to position things, and people don't appreciate how big a deal it is that you have the right cell in the right place. Throw a frog in a blender and you'll basically see the problem.
Yeah. So any final words on the evolution of nerve cells and nervous system?
Yes, I've only touched the tip of the iceberg of the problems. We have covered it kind of in a very superficial level. The problems will get worse. So if you think I'm just throwing, terms and jargon and that I've covered this, I said just, and you think that you'll be able to figure out more, that it'll look more favorable to evolution the more we learn. The opposite is happening. The trend has been, and this is why I reject evolution, is that 40 years ago we wouldn't make these arguments as forcefully as we are making them now. And over the last 40 years, I've seen the arguments against evolutionary theory get stronger the more we know. That tells me, just as kind of being a pundit, the more we discover, the worse it's going to be. They keep promising, the evolutionary biologists, that the more, we're going to figure it out. And with each passing year, and I'd almost like to say each passing minute, you're going to get more things that are going to challenge you, because we see more and more complexity. The more we study this, the more complex it gets. And I've only touched the tip of the iceberg. So yeah, the readers that don't share my views, I just encourage you to just look at this more and more and more, and think of it kind of the way that we've covered it here. It's going to get worse for evolution theory the more that you study this. The only thing the only recourse they have are these phylogenetic reconstructions, but where they just basically try to do the Maury show thing, where we see, oh, this piece looks similar to that. I'm just saying, I'll grant you that. The problem is using the ingredients in a coherent way. How do you evolve that? How can you select for something that doesn't exist? So my final word is, it's going to get worse for evolutionary theory. They're resting on a lot of unscientific speculations that are not provable. And if you want to, people are wondering why people are skeptical, it's because you don't have proof. You compare that to other sciences like physics, where we can prove the basics of electromagnetic theory every day. That's why our devices work. We don't have anything like that, anything like electromagnetic theory or any of the major theories in physics in evolutionary biology. And maybe one final punch. We studied the nerve cell today. When I studied this, I was shocked that the research teams had engineers there. A lot of modern researchers that research stuff like this have no use for evolutionary biologists. That should tell you something.
Yeah, and I will say for the audience, we did look very superficially at the nerve cell, and originally Sal wanted to show this 13-minute video of the inner workings with all the
the
dynamics that happen
the ion
in the
channels
nerve
and pumps.
And I said it's too boring. But if anyone thinks we have simplified this too much, please do go and watch a video about the inner workings of the nerve cell and the incredible dynamic that happens there. It's it blows your mind when you think about all the things that are involved and what's actually happening in that process. So like you said, people don't like it when we liken biological systems to machinery, but when you see what's happening, like you said, as an electrical engineer, you were on the edge of your seat because it's so fantastic.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much, Sal.
And thank you.